In 2010, a 44-year-old man named Jeff Boiler was interviewed by the Portland Tribune. The interview was based on the release of a report titled Vines that had been released when an officer digging through files found the report and released it to the paper. The Tribune had first sought out the former sheriff, but he had died a few years earlier, so Jeff was selected. Jeff hadn't mentioned the file to anyone but the sheriff at the time, but since several years had passed, Jeff was willing to do the interview. This is Jeff's story. It was the summer of 1996 in Oregon when Jeff Boiler took up employment at the Wasco County Sheriff's Office as a sheriff's deputy. Boiler was an ex-Marine who had been discharged from the military due to an overcrowded unit. Coming home to Oregon, Jeff had no job, so a good friend of his family, Albert Ronald, the sheriff of Wasco County, offered him a job as the sheriff's deputy. Excited to be working for a good friend, Jeff accepted the job. Jeff worked hard for about 8 months until Albert felt that he was such a good worker that he could have a day off. It was a beautiful day, and rather than go home and visit his wife, Jeff decided that it seemed like a good day to take a hike in the nearby Cascade Mountains. The mountains were only about 3 miles away from the sheriff's office, so Jeff grabbed his backpack, throwing in a couple of granola bars from the office vending machine and a few bottles of water. Waving goodbye to the sheriff, who was going to stay late to fill out some paperwork, Jeff climbed into his Ford pickup, driving down the dirt road towards the Cascades. It was about 5 when Jeff arrived at the edge of the Cascades, climbing out of his truck and pulling his pack onto one arm, unbuttoning his deputy shirt, revealing a white muscle shirt underneath. Leaving his pistol strapped onto his hip in its holster, Jeff took off into the woods, leaving the pickup far behind him on the dirt road. Jeff began following the trailhead, moving across the strenuous rocky trail at high speeds, making great time and covering a few miles in about an hour. Realizing that the trail was too easy for him, he sat down on a rock and began to ponder different paths across the mountain he could take. Jeff reached into his bag, grabbing a Fiber One Chewy bar from his pack, opening it and taking a bite, curling up his nose at the taste of the bar. He had never been a fan of peanut butter. After sitting for a while, Jeff decided it would be fun to hike off the trail cross country. The prospect of hiking somewhere on the mountain where possibly no other human had ever set foot excited me, Jeff remembers. I had no idea what I would find. Stomaching through the rest of the bar, Jeff climbed to his feet, swallowing a few drops of water from one of the bottles, heading off down a game trail about 10 feet from the path. Small plants seemed to grab at the strings of his boots, trying to keep him from leaving, while spider webs jumped on his face. Jeff smiled, pushing forward. This was the kind of thing he loved to do. Jeff continued to hike for about an hour through the woods, of which he gained 1.5 miles and about 500 feet in altitude, when he decided he would get out his map and plan a shorter way to his truck. He wanted to make it before the sun went down. Laying out the map on a flat rock, he plotted the point that was his truck on the map, then estimated where he was on the mountain based on the terrain. Pulling out his compass, Jeff opened it, orienting it to face north, lining up the wire with the slot, aiming at the top of a rise in the direction of his car. Turning the compass to face west, aiming the sight at the sun, Jeff began to cast a shadow on his map in the direction of the truck, showing his path. Continuing to hold the compass in one hand while drawing a line down the shadow on the map, Jeff plotted his direction of travel. When he was done, he closed the pen, sliding it into his pocket, looking back up the compass to check one more time that his reading was correct. Where the sun had been in the sights, a dark shape now stood. It was humanoid, stood about 6 to 7 feet tall, and it looked almost like tangled vines. Jeff was stunned, staring for a long time at the figure which just stood as still as he was. Jeff cocked his head, trying to get the sun from behind the creature so he could study its features, but something strange happened. Just as I cocked my head, the thing mimicked me, Jeff notes, the color draining from his face. It was definitely intelligent. Jeff stood there, shocked for a few moments, before reaching into his holster and pulling out his revolver, pulling back the hammer, balancing the gun on his other arm for support, and lining up the creature. Just as quickly as it had appeared, though, the creature was gone. vanishing with a blood-curdling shriek which was remarkably similar to a hawk's. Lowering his pistol, Jeff grabbed his map, pushing it into one of the pockets of his cargo pants, lowering the hammer of the pistol, and shoving it back into its holster. Throwing his pack onto his back again, Jeff took off on the azimuth that he had oriented, moving slightly faster than he had before, trying to put the creature from his mind. That worked only for about an hour, until the booms began. Jeff was walking, eating another Fiber One bar, when a loud crash that filled the entire woods sounded through the trees. Jeff jumped, spinning around looking for what made the noise, but he saw nothing, just the trees and vines. Becoming paranoid, Jeff took off running as fast as he could, jumping over a fallen log, sliding under a vine, and going so fast that the wind was like a roar in his ears. He ran as far as he could, sliding to a halt, panting and sweating, thinking he had escaped. But then the crack came again. It was booming and caused Jeff to cringe. The crack was closer this time. Jeff dashed off again, his body crying out for a break. Just one moment to take a breath, but he knew, deep down inside, that there was no time. If he wanted to make it out of this, to see his family again, he had to run. It was dark now, and the sun had completely disappeared behind the mountains. Jeff was running only by moonlight now. Jeff had just one thing to say at this point in his recollection. "I'm a United States Marine. I trained in boot camp for 16 weeks, fought in Desert Storm and Operation El Dorado," he said. "Not much scares me, but this scared me. I didn't know if I was going to live to see another day." The breaking continued, and trying to regain hold of his mind, Jeff came up with a way to lose his pursuer. If he could turn around, run in a circle, then take back off on the azimuth, he might be able to gain a few yards headway. Turning back to look behind him, all Jeff saw was a mass and tangle of vines. Preparing to flank the pursuit, Jeff entered a field, about a 100-yard break in the tree line. The field was filled with chest-high weeds and grass that had never been touched by any blade, and had a line of telephone wires across it. Standing in the middle of the field was a lone deer. It was a 6-point buck of good size, and it was staring directly at Jeff as he ran into the field. Unalarmed, the deer continued to graze. Jeff chuckled, preparing to head off when the deer looked up, fixing its gaze just over Jeff's shoulder. Turning around, Jeff once again scanned the tree line, but saw nothing other than vines and trees. The deer, which had once been completely calm and collected, took off, bounding through the grassland and into the woods. Shocked, Jeff jumped about 5 feet in the air when another crack resounded. This time, it sounded like it was right next to him. It was so loud that Jeff involuntarily grabbed his ear, hissing in pain as his ear rang. He knew that if there were ever a time to do his flank, now was the time. Turning to his left, Jeff took off, beginning to count. 1, 2, 3, 4. All the way until he reached 10, turning sharply to the right, slightly at an angle from the trees, dashing into the opposite tree line from whence he came. His hiking boots were not suited for mad dashes through the deep wilderness, however, and soon he was caught up on a root, turning his ankle, rolling down a steep embankment and landing next to a rock a good 20 feet from where he had been. On the ridge above him stood the thing that had been chasing him. The sun had gone down, so now it was much easier to see what had been pursuing him. The thing was stooped over on all fours, peering down on Jeff, its piercing orange eyes digging into his soul. It was almost composed only of vines and sticks, twisted into a disfigured shape of a man. Where its eyes and mouth should have been, there were 2 small holes above one huge hole, which blazed with fire. It let off another deafening screech, jarring Jeff back into action. He reached for his pistol, but came back with nothing. He must have dropped his revolver when he slid down the embankment. Taking off again, Jeff hurdled a rock as he heard a loud boom behind him, assumably from the creature jumping off of the embankment, landing just a few yards behind him. Panting heavily, Jeff took a turn to his right, smiling and laughing to himself as he noticed that he had just passed a blue trailhead marker. His celebration was cut short, though, as another loud bang echoed across the forest. One last bang, but this time, it was in front of him. Turning his head in the direction of the sound, Jeff saw a tree, bent over, snap directly down the middle. The tree was about 6 inches across.
I realized that if this thing could snap trees this big around, it could snap me in half too.
It was about 5 minutes later when the bang stopped, clearing the woods of all noises other than Jeff's heavy breathing and the sounds of him running. Following the trailheads, Jeff picked up the pace of his mad dash, seeing the parking lot in the distance, his lonely pickup seeming to glare at him as he ran.
I knew that when the snapping stopped, he was so close that he could have grabbed me.
So Jeff dove down the slope to his vehicle, reaching for his keys, unlocking the car and climbing in. Rushing the key into the ignition, Jeff started his pickup, flooring it and taking off, down the road and back to the ranger station. Looking in his rearview mirror, Jeff saw the creature standing right where his car had been, standing tall, his fiery face glowing with an ethereal light, a long, viney hand wrapped around a tree. The tree was about 5 inches across, but the vine thing's hand closed fully around the tree, its fingers overlapping. With one hand, it ripped the tree from its roots with incredible strength, one last boom filling the woods as the tree fell to the ground, breaking in half. Growling, the fire intensifying in the thing's mouth, the vine creature jumped, covering 15 feet in one bound, disappearing into the imposing tree line, never to be seen again by Jeff. Arriving at the ranger station, Jeff parked his truck, climbing out and dashing to the front door, banging on it with all of his might, and looking over his shoulder the entire time. After a few seconds, the door opened, and Sheriff Ronald answered the door, his coat and hat on. He was getting ready to leave, but seeing the look on Jeff's face, he stepped aside, allowing his deputy to enter. Over a cup of coffee and a non-peanut butter granola bar, Jeff related his experience to his employer, in the back of his mind knowing that he would be thought a fool, maybe even fired. To his surprise, all Arnold did was nod and sip his coffee, listening to the entire story. When Jeff had finished, Sheriff Arnold stood up, moving to a nearby bookshelf and pulling out a manila folder. Reaching inside, he removed a few pages, paper-clipped together, and handed them to Jeff.
On the first page was a map of the Cascades,
Jeff recalls.
There were about 16 red Sharpie marks on the map, all clustered in an area the size of my fist, revolving around a blue point.
Sheriff Arnold told Jeff all of the marks were of times he had sighted the creature that Jeff had described, and that most of them seemed to be centered around the ruins of an old farmhouse on the top of the mountains, the Blue Point. As far as he could figure, the ruins were the creature's haunt. The second piece of paper, as Jeff describes it, was
an old yellowed photograph showing a small family of farmers.
The picture showed a tall man and his wife, surrounded by 3 young children. According to Sheriff Arnold, it was the family that lived in the abandoned farmhouse, the family that had been chased off by the creature. Lastly, there was a drawing. It showed the creature in full color, sketched by a magnificent artist. Its eyes glowed orange, the mouth filled with orange light. Jeff sat down the drawing, looking into Arnold's eyes, asking him what the creature was. Standing up and heading to the door, Arnold looked out of the door, beginning to speak. The thing, as he said, was a demon that a woman living in the farmhouse had summoned, giving life to an old tree. In a fit of rage against her family, the woman had ordered the demon to kill them. After the demon had completed his task, the woman, realizing what she had done, killed herself. But not before one last command of the demon. No one was to reach the top of the mountain and return alive. Stunned, Jeff finished his coffee and prepared to leave. Just before he left, however, the sheriff caught him by the shoulder and pulled him in close, whispering in his ear. Arnold told Jeff to keep this between only them, at least until a few years had passed. Releasing him, Sheriff Arnold sat back down in his chair as Jeff drove off in his pickup truck, trying to put the incident behind him. Less than 5 years ago, Sheriff Arnold died in a tragic arsonist fire at the sheriff's office. The fire, however, has never been explained, and appeared to have been caused by an extremely intense flame.